Before we begin, take a moment to slow down, dim the lights, grab a blanket, and find a comfortable spot to rest. Let the day fade away as you settle in. This story was made to be heard while your eyes grow heavy and the world quiets around you. If you enjoy this kind of gentle storytelling, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these tales alive. Now, let's journey back in time and discover how medieval peasants survived. In the misty dawns of medieval Europe, peasants awoke not to silence, but to the muffled sounds of hooves, distant bells, and the wind stirring through wooden roofs. Their lives were tethered to the land, ruled by seasons, toil, and the unforgiving laws of nature. Survival was not a choice, but a rhythm. One woke with the sun, worked until dusk, and knelt each night, in silent hope that frost, fire, or famine would not visit before morning. Peasants lived in thatched cottages, built from wattle and daub. Their beds were stuffed with straw, their roofs prone to leak, and their hearths the only source of warmth. Men, women, and children shared these small spaces, sometimes with livestock crowding into corners, like family members. The scent of wood smoke lingered, thick and permanent. Clothing was simple. Linen and wool dyed in muted tones, usually browns and grays, spun at home and passed down from generation to generation. Peasants did not own much, but they knew every stitch by heart. Their diets centered around pottage, a thick stew of grain, vegetables, and sometimes meat if luck allowed. Bread was a daily staple, coarse and dense, baked in communal ovens. Fish was consumed on religious fast days, and on rare occasions, fresh cheese and fruits graced their bowls. Salt was precious, meat rarer still, and hunger a familiar companion. Agriculture was their lifeline, fields plowed with wooden tools, oxen pulling blades through stubborn earth. Seasons dictated everything. Spring meant sowing, summer meant sweating, autumn meant harvest, and winter meant endurance. Tools broke, hands bled, but the land demanded loyalty, and the reward was survival, not prosperity. Religion was central to every life. Peasants believed deeply and fervently, attending Mass, confessing sins, marking saints' days with ritual and song. Their lives were narrated by the church calendar, their fears soothed and stoked by sermons carved in Latin. The priest was both spiritual guide and social authority. His words mattered, his blessings reassured, and his disapproval could mean social exile. Lords ruled from manners distant and imposing. Peasants owed them labor, grain, eggs, loyalty, and coin, when coin could be found. In return, they received protection, or at least the idea of it. They worked the Lord's fields, mended his fences, fetched his water, and feared his wrath. Yet among themselves, peasants formed quiet communities built on mutual aid and oral tradition. Folklore, herbs, midwives, and seasonal rites flourished away from the eyes of clergy and nobility. Children played with carved wooden toys, ran through fields, learned by imitation, and entered work before they had finished growing. They were taught with stories, with tasks, with warnings. Peasant life was hard, but not lifeless. There was laughter at festivals, joy in weddings, music at births, and pride in persistence. One learned to fix, mend, heal, improvise, barter, and endure. Natural disasters, plague, war, and taxation threatened their fragile balance. Yet peasants survived. not because they had choice, but because they had tradition, cooperation, resilience. They learned from ancestors, taught their children, and adapted in ways too subtle for history books to record. They survived by planting before frost, harvesting before rot, and trusting the wisdom passed down in hushed fireside tales. While the manor walls loomed, they held no promise of comfort for those who labored below. The life of a peasant was dictated by obligation, tithes to the church, fees to the Lord, tasks to the land, and loyalty to kin. Their tools were basic, forged by local smiths, sharpened on stones, and often repaired with scraps and ingenuity. Nails were scarce, iron precious, and rope repurposed until it frayed into unusability. Animals were both companions and currency. Chickens supplied eggs, pigs fattened slowly, and cows provided milk and future meat. A lost animal could mean a lost winter. Peasants were clever in how they stored food. Salted meats hung from rafters. Grain was kept in woven baskets, and root vegetables buried deep in cold earth to last through snow. No storage was perfect, and mice were a constant enemy. Cats were prized not for affection, but for their ability to guard the harvest. Despite poverty, peasants rarely lived entirely without joy. Storytelling was sacred. Around flickering hearths, elders shared tales of spirits, heroic ancestors, cursed woods, and miraculous saints. These stories passed knowledge, morality, and warnings down through generations with a cadence that books could not rival. Music, played on crude flutes or stringed instruments, turned otherwise silent nights into celebrations. A wedding, though modest, could unite dozens from neighboring villages. Mead would flow, bread would be broken, and dancing would blur the boundary between hardship and happiness. The turning of the year brought festivals like harvest feasts and May Day rituals. Children wore wreaths of flowers, and fields saw games and song where plows had previously carved. Death was no stranger. Without medicine as we know it, illness claimed many. Herbal remedies kept by wise women held the power of generations of trial and error. Fever, cough, and injury were constant threats, and the specter of plague haunted even the remotest village. Still, the dead were honored, buried, with rites and tears, and the living went on. Justice was rough and local. Disputes between neighbors could be resolved by the Lord's steward, but often gossip, shame, and reconciliation were the real tools of resolution. Theft, betrayal, or dishonor could lead to exile, lashings, or worse, but such extremes were rare compared to the social fabric that bound communities together. Education, if it existed, was imparted orally or by scribes in monasteries. For most peasants, learning meant learning how to live, how to raise animals, plant seed, gather herbs, weave baskets, and survive the winter. Knowledge was communal, sacred, and practical. Time was measured by the sun, the moon, and bells from the chapel tower. Hours were long, but lives often short. Yet, in the simplest moments, a sunrise over frosted fields, a shared loaf between siblings, laughter echoing through the woods, life showed its quiet beauty. As seasons turned and generations passed, peasants became masters of routine, improvisation, and subtle rebellion. Their songs whispered grievances, their dances carried stories of resistance, and their humor softened the edges of drudgery. The arrival of merchants and travelers brought news from beyond the hedgerows, stories of faraway wars, new tools, and rare trinkets. Coins trickled into the village economy, and barter remained dominant. A basket of eggs might buy a spindle. A pail of milk, a pair of shoes, and a good favor could be repaid with silence or shelter. Walls were rare, except around the manor, but boundaries were understood. A footpath here, a stream there, and always the unspoken rules of field and forest. Peasants learned to read the weather like a book. Clouds foretold rain, the scent of soil warned of rot, and birdsong marked both danger and season. Thunder might ruin a harvest, drought might starve a village, and frost might kill a hope. Yet each sunrise still summoned a willingness to try again. Women bore the weight of survival as much as the men. They fetched water, tended gardens, raised children, nursed the sick, spun thread, baked bread, and still found moments to teach, sing, and mend. Their wisdom, passed not through written texts but quiet repetition, shaped the rhythm of daily life. Midwives and herbalists held knowledge, as potent as any scholars, and their hands worked in silence while the world turned beyond their door. Childhood was short, and work began young. A boy might learn to thatch before his 12th birthday, a girl to weave or care for goats before her first festival braid. Lessons were lived, not lectured. Small hands learned from larger ones' eyes, watched and remembered, and mistakes taught faster than scolding. Peasants rarely wandered far, yet their minds traveled through stories, dreams, and legends. Tales of dragons, saints, buried gold, and enchanted woods danced at the edge of candlelight, while bell towers marked time with solemn tones. The village was not just a place, it was a living organism. From dawn's rooster crow to the murmur of prayers at dusk, every sound and sight held meaning. A broken gate could mean a neighbor sick, an empty field, a death in the family, a sudden hush, a stranger passing. Within that web of small details, peasants survived by knowing and being known. Animals sensed what words could not. A restless dog might foretell a storm, a silent barn might speak of illness. Pigs grunted in patterns, geese followed weather, and oxen knew wariness like old men. Farmers listened and acted. Care was not kindness, it was strategy. Superstition mingled with observation. A spilled pail might bring misfortune. A dream of fire could mean warning. A crow on the roof might be omen or nonsense, but it would not go unnoticed. Peasants crafted charms, recited prayers, wore herbs, and honored both saints and shadows. The sacred and the superstitious existed side by side. Salt on thresholds, a sprig of rosemary, whispered words before crossing a bridge. Hardship gave rise to belief, and belief gave shape to endurance. Not every peasant bowed with submission. History forgets their names, but in every village there was one who questioned the steward, challenged the bishop, or carved defiant symbols into chapel doors. Resistance was not loud. It was the refusal to break, the act of planting anyway, of singing even when hungry, of showing kindness when fear demanded isolation. Their legacy lived not in fame but in survival. Everyday life demanded the peasant to be both craftsman and caretaker. From repairing fences with woven branches to shaping clay into vessels for storing grain. Their hands knew tasks that no school could teach. The knowledge was tactile. Muscle memory passed from calloused palm to eager fingers. Time itself moved in circles, sowing, growing, harvesting, suffering, and surviving. Each repetition built not just rhythm, but resilience. Villages did not exist in isolation. They were connected by dirt roads, trade paths, and seasonal markets where goods, gossip, and glances exchanged with ease. Travel beyond these paths was rare, but when necessary, it carried a mix of danger and awe. Bandits, wild animals, illness, and terrain all threatened progress. And yet peasants traveled for marriages, funerals, or festivals, sometimes walking for days with baskets on their backs and hope in their hearts. The presence of knights or soldiers brought both fear and fascination. Armor glinting under sun could signal protection or oppression. A mounted troop passing through might offer coin in exchange for food, or they might take without asking. War was a distant rumor until it became a knock at the door. Then peasants dug trenches, hid grain, fled into forests, or prayed for mercy. Castles were not refuge for them, but symbols, stone and strength beyond their reach. When sieges came, they were the overlooked and overburdened, often forced to feed both attacker and defender. Famines struck like ghosts. Crops failed, rain vanished, or came in too much. Insects consumed harvests faster than hands could work, and grain stores emptied while mouths remained. Hunger carved into cheeks and bellies, slowed steps, and quieted laughter. Yet, even then, they found ways to stretch flour with bark, brew soup from nettles, and chew roots too bitter for nobles to name. Plague was silent and sudden. Rats scurried unseen, breath grew heavy, and doorways marked with ash or symbols told what words could not. Families shrank, villages wept, and some left entire homes untouched, fearing the curse lingered in stone. Still, those who remained cleaned with vinegar, burned herbs, prayed fiercely, and marked each survival with whispered thanks. In such darkness, light was cherished. Births were miracles. A child surviving the first year was cause for festival. Names were chosen with care, often honoring saints, ancestors, or traits the parents prayed the child would grow into. Baptisms were community events, not only spiritual but social, binding the new soul to a network of arms willing to shelter and scold. Marriage was not just love, it was alliance, economy, and continuity. Land passed through unions, livestock merged, debts settled, and futures shaped by who danced together under garlands of flowers. Aging was neither rare nor easy. Bones ached from decades of toil, eyesight blurred by smoke and sun, and hands curled with the memory of tools no longer held. Yet elders were honored as keepers of memory. Their wisdom, told in stories and riddles, was the pulse of the past feeding the present. Fireplaces became forums, and wrinkled skin was a map of lessons endured. Through this life, peasants did not merely exist. They remembered, adapted, mourned, and celebrated with a depth that paper could never hold. Not all hardship came from nature. Taxation weighed like a shadow, even in fruitful years. Lords demanded shares of harvest, sometimes arbitrarily, sometimes backed by writs no peasant could read. When grain was taken, meals grew smaller, and when coin was scarce, tools and animals were surrendered. Resistance was whispered, hidden in undermeasured bushels and quiet barter among neighbors. Trust was vital. Villages thrived through networks of favors, gestures, and shared pain. A broken cart, mended by a neighbor, earned more loyalty than gold. These quiet exchanges kept communities upright when the crown's demand bent them low. The arrival of new tools, a metal plow, a stronger yoke, was cause for celebration. Innovation arrived slowly, filtered through monasteries, wandering smiths, or noble whims. Yet peasants adapted swiftly, finding new ways to plant, grind, or store what little they had. Curiosity was not reserved for cities. It glimmered in barns and by wells, shaped by necessity. Tales of saints performing miracles on muddy roads held more sway than books bound in velvet. Religion was woven deeply, but folk belief thrived beside it. A charm buried beneath a tree, a whispered name to the stars, a carved symbol on a doorway. These acts gave hope where logic failed. Every ritual, every motion carried intent. Washing hands before sunrise, weaving clockwise, planting under moonlight, all tied body and belief into a daily rhythm. Festivals were rare but potent. The Feast of St. Martin, harvest festivals, solstice gatherings, these moments allowed joy to surface. Peasants decorated homes with flowers, danced until legs trembled, shared stories with overflowing cups, and reminded each other that joy was both rebellion and relief. Meat might be roasted, bread shared, and young couples form new promises under garlands strung from barn to tree. Though wealth eluded them, spirit did not. Story was armor, memory was shield. They spoke of ancestors who endured worse, of seasons that returned after failure, and of small blessings, a healthy child, a mild winter, a generous neighbor. These became currency far beyond coin. Even the act of resting held ritual. Before sleep, some recited prayers, others hummed old tunes, and many simply lay in silence, reflecting on survival. Sleep offered escape, but also healing, and dreams became vessels for hope and warning. A dream of abundant wheat gave courage. A dream of fire spurred preparation. Waking came with purpose, with roosters calling and dew marking labor's return. Peasants taught each other, learned through doing, failing, repeating. A burned loaf led to a wiser baker, a weak fence, to a sturdier builder. Each mistake was absorbed into communal wisdom, shaping generations through quiet resilience. They sang songs that carried history, not dates or wars, but floods, famines, births, and joy. These ballads outlasted lords, maps, and scribes, held in breath and voice. Their lives were carved into unseen legacy, the soil bearing witness long, after names faded from stone. Survival was not just persistence, it was an art. Then we continue along the winding path of endurance and legacy. In every corner of the village, life pulsed quietly, shaped not by grand events, but by repeated ritual and shared breath. Evenings brought reflection. Farmers mending tools, mothers brushing ash from loaves, elders humming tunes from youth. Light came from fire, not invention, and its flicker marked safety, story, and kinship. When winter arrived, it did so with weight. Snow-covered fields, silenced roads, and forced families to draw closer, both physically and emotionally. Meals became simpler, laughter, quieter, and the hearth, a beacon. Children learned to stitch and carve, to listen to silence, and to endure boredom as a teacher. Scarcity taught appreciation. A single apple lasted days. A sliver of cheese was split among siblings. Kindness grew from necessity. One shared blanket warmed 3 souls. Outside, trees cracked with frost, and animals huddled, the cold teaching lessons more lasting than scripture. Firewood was gathered weeks in advance, each log a promise. Ice on buckets, frost on windows, and steam rising from mouths created a world both cruel and oddly beautiful. The rich slept beneath furs, the poor beneath layers stitched from old tunics and rough cloth. Yet, in both cases, sleep came only after prayer. Spring was rebirth, not just of nature, but of hope. Buds formed where snow had melted, birds returned, fields were turned again, tools sharpened, hands toughened anew. The rhythm restarted, familiar but never easy. Elders taught planting by gestures, and young ones mimicked with reverence. Missteps were forgiven, but remembered. Farming was not merely practical, it was sacred. Each furrow, each seed, was placed with intention and quiet hope. Rain that fell was blessing. Sunlight was celebration. Growth was proof that effort mattered. Insects were battled with herbs and grit. Weeds pulled with sighs and songs. Villages depended on one another more than they admitted. During illness, neighbors brought herbs. During hardship, meals were shared. Grudges faded in the face of flood, fire, or famine. The soil may have separated households, but humanity stitched them together. Legacy lived in unseen places. In the worn shovel passed from father to son, the lullaby murmured before sleep, the footprint hardened in the dirt outside a threshold. History may not name these peasants, but the land remembers. Their sweat, memory, their breath tradition, and across centuries, their survival becomes not just a tale, but a testament. Beneath layers of labor and obscurity lived hearts rich with endurance, dreams, and the kind of strength forged by repetition rather than recognition. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, peasants turned their focus from planting to tending. Crops were weeded daily, water hauled in buckets from wells or streams, and scarecrows patched with worn tunics guarded fields from crows that spoke of ruin. Bees buzzed between lavender and wild thyme, and their honey was both medicine and delicacy. Children learned to track growth, noticing each sprout and root as a milestone in their living calendar. Mothers knelt beside daughters to teach the texture of healthy soil, the sound of a wormed stalk, the scent of onions ready to lift from earth. Fathers passed down the rhythm of sharpening blades, mending harnesses, and listening for a shift in wind that could alter the day. The forest bordering the village was both friend and foe. Its woods provided mushrooms, berries, firewood, and herbs, but also hid predators, wolves, bandits, and the unknown. A lone figure in the trees sparked caution. A strange sound after twilight brought whispers. Yet the forest was also sacred ground, where trees grew older than memory and clearings held ritual. When a child was born under a full moon, some villagers would gift a sprig of elderberry and mark a stone with the child's initials. These gestures, half tradition, half magic, were stitched into daily life. Water was not simply consumed, but revered. Springs were marked with symbols, streams with stones, and wells decorated during solstice festivals. Clean water was survival, and its scarcity in drought taught reverence early. In summer, heat parched the land. Shirts clung to skin, animals slowed, and tempers shortened. The earth cracked like old pottery, and shade became currency. Elders rested beneath oaks, children dipped feet into shallows, and songs were sung slower. Peasants adjusted pace, knowing the land did not heed complaint. Festivals broke the monotony. Ribbons tied to trees, bread shaped like suns, fire leaping into dark. These were the moments when burden turned briefly into celebration. Though wealth was absent, creativity bloomed. Tunics were dyed with beetroot, dolls carved from roots, and masks made from bark and ash turned children into mythical beasts. Stories recited during such nights were vivid and visceral. Tales of women who talked to birds, men who wrestled shadows, and lakes that swallowed lies. As evening returned, so did ritual. Doors were bolted with whispered blessings. Footprints were wiped from thresholds. Children were told to keep dreams gentle, and as embers dimmed, silence rose not in fear, but in reflection. Each day survived was its own kind of victory, and in that quiet, peasants became more than subjects. They were the heartbeat of the earth. As twilight settled once more over the village, the familiar chorus of crickets and murmuring winds returned to frame the quiet rituals of peasant life. Shadows lengthened on cottage walls, marking the hours not with clocks, but with instinct. The smell of boiled grain drifted from hearths, mingling with smoke that traced invisible patterns into the dusky sky. A dog barked in the distance, and someone whistled a slow tune while gathering kindling. Evenings were sacred, time to rest, reflect, and restore strength. The elder might begin a tale as the youngest leaned in, eyes wide and curious. Stories were not just entertainment, they were bridges to ancestors, cautionary lessons in disguise, and sparks for imagination. Tales of harvest spirits, miraculous, healing, and mischievous forest tricksters filled the air and stayed in memory long after sleep. Romance flourished quietly in these moments, not in grand gestures, but in passing glances, shared tasks, and hands brushing at the well. Courtship followed traditions, exchange of small gifts, songs shared under moonlight, or dances held during feast days. These bonds formed the lattice upon which future families grew. When harvest finally came, it arrived with urgency and gratitude. Sickles sliced through golden grain, backs bent under baskets, and children gathered fallen fruit in woven satchels. The rhythm of harvest echoed through the fields like song and sweat braided together. Every meal from this yield carried pride, every loaf a memory of labor. Scarcity faded, replaced for a brief season with abundance, laughter, and relief. Food was preserved with salt and smoke, stored in earthen jars, and hidden beneath boards for lean months to come. Some villages marked the end of harvest with torchlight processions, garlanded animals, and hymns sung into the wind. Gratitude layered into the fabric of survival. As year followed year, change crept in slowly. A stranger might pass through with news of faraway events. A king crowned, a war declared, a new invention glimpsed. Peasants listened, nodded, then returned to planting. Change came not from decree, but from the steady hand of tradition, adapting quietly. A new tool here, a different seed there. Slowly, resilience evolved. Death remained a constant companion, but funerals were not merely ends, they were affirmations of legacy. A life was measured not by wealth, but by memory. Who they helped, what they built, how they endured. Graves marked with stones, songs, or carved wooden tokens stood in fields that bore witness. Peasants did not carve monuments, they lived them. When storms broke roofs and floods stole grain, they rebuilt without despair. Strength was not loud. It was doing the same hard thing again without bitterness. The sun would rise, and with it, they rose in silence, in song, in stubborn love for each other and the land they survived. Not just as individuals, but as threads in a vast, stubborn tapestry the world too often overlooked but never unraveled. As years turned into decades, and generations took root where the last had knelt, the legacy of medieval peasants whispered in places unseen. Though stone did not bear their names, and parchment ignored their prayers, the land remembered every footstep. Their lives were lived not for glory, but for growth, not for conquest, but for continuity. They shaped soil with hope, stitched torn tunics with persistence, and sang under stars as if music alone could keep the world from crumbling. In their silence there was strength, in their labor there was love, and in their survival there was triumph. The tale of the medieval peasant is not carved in cathedrals, nor sung in royal courts. It lives instead in the quiet spaces of endurance. And so this chapter ends, not with fanfare, but with a steady breath, a final glance at the hearth, and the unshakable truth that in every season they endured, they taught the world what it truly means to survive.